A billionaire once noticed a poor waitress feeding his disabled son outside a restaurant. Unlike everyone else who ignored the boy, this young woman showed him kindness and care. What the billionaire did afterward was unexpected, but the truth that followed was even more surprising. In Victoria Island stood a famous restaurant called the Golden Fork, always filled with politicians, business moguls, and celebrities. Yet Sophie, one of its waitresses, barely paid attention to them. Her focus was on earning enough to survive. She had grown up in hardship. Her father died in a car accident when she was just 14, and soon after, her mother, a nurse, was diagnosed with kidney failure. Sophie left school to support her mother and younger brother, Matthew. Every naira mattered, for rent, food, school fees, and her mother's dialysis. She worked wherever she could, cleaning, washing, and finally as a waitress at the Golden Fork every evening. That evening, after her shift ended, the city was drenched in rain. The air was cold, and the ground still wet. She carried a small meal from the restaurant and made her way toward the bus stop. On the busy road filled with people hurrying home, something unusual caught her eye. Beneath the dim glow of a street lamp sat a boy in a wheelchair, completely alone. Unlike other beggars she had seen, no one stood near him. She slowed down, puzzled by the sight, while everyone else walked past without care. Her conscience wouldn't let her leave him there. She walked closer and knelt in front of him. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice calm like a lullaby. "Why are you here alone? Where are your parents?" The boy's lips moved, but no words came out. His body shook with cold, his face blank. She heard his stomach rumble and felt a pang of sorrow. Without hesitation, she took off her coat, wrapped it around him, and opened her food. When she noticed his twisted legs, she realized he was disabled. But it didn't matter to her. He was just a child in need. Carefully, she lifted a spoonful of rice, blew on it, and fed him gently, one bite after another, just as she once cared for her brother when he was sick. The boy slowly ate, his expression softening. When she introduced herself, he couldn't speak, but he gave her a faint smile. She didn't realize a black SUV with tinted windows was parked across the street. Inside sat Richard Grayson, a billionaire real estate mogul. The boy Sophie had just fed was his son, Samson. For over 2 years, Samson hadn't smiled despite doctors and teachers trying everything. Richard's chest tightened at the sight. "Take a picture," he whispered to his driver, capturing the moment. Moments later, another car pulled up. A stiff-faced chauffeur approached, ignored Sophie completely, and wheeled Samson away despite her protests to cover him properly. Sophie stood helpless as they drove off, her heart heavy. The next morning, she arrived at work late because the bus broke down. The manager was waiting with folded arms. "Sophie, in my office." His tone was sharp. Inside, he didn't even let her sit. "I got a call. Someone saw you with a crippled child yesterday." She blinked in disbelief. "Yes, I saw a boy. He was alone. What does that have to do with work?" His face hardened. "Our clients are wealthy. They don't like seeing staff mingling with every beggar on the street. This is not a charity house." Her mouth fell open. "So, I should have ignored him like everyone else?" He couldn't even speak. "I don't care. Perception matters. You're fired. Pack your things." Her heart sank. With trembling hands, she left the restaurant. How would she afford her mother's treatment now? How would she keep Matthew in school? Every step she took to the bus stop was heavy with despair. As she stood quietly beneath the shelter, a sleek black car stopped beside her. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding an envelope. "Miss Sophie Miller?" he asked. Startled, she nodded. Without another word, he handed her the envelope and returned to the car. Sophie sat frozen, staring at it. Finally, with shaky hands, she opened it. Inside was a photograph of her feeding the boy in the wheelchair. Beneath it lay a folded check of 500,000 naira, written in her name. The last item was a letter. "Miss Miller, your compassion did not go unnoticed. There is a child who needs you. A permanent caregiver position awaits you with fair hours, full accommodation, and excellent pay. No interview required. Report to this address tomorrow by 8 a.m. If you choose not to, no harm will come. But if you do, everything in your life may change." At the bottom was an address in Ikoyi, one of the richest estates in Lagos. Sophie's lips trembled as she read the letter again and again. For the first time in days, she smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the letter, the photo, and the check, wondering who the boy really was, and why someone had been watching her. At dawn, she dressed neatly, her clothes ironed with care. Before leaving, she gave her mother and Matthew the address, just in case anything went wrong. With cautious hope, Sophie set out for Ikoyi, unaware that her life was about to change forever. When Sophie finally arrived at the street in Ikoyi, everything felt different. Unlike the noisy part of Lagos she came from, there were no generators buzzing, no hawkers shouting, and no children playing football on the road. The silence was calm and almost strange to her. She found the address written in the letter, and before her stood a massive mansion with security cameras fixed at the gates. Before she could knock, an intercom crackled. "Name?" asked a deep voice. Startled, she quickly replied, "Sophie. Sophie Miller. I was invited." There was a short pause before the heavy gates slid open, revealing a breathtaking compound lined with exotic cars. Sophie followed the path, her heart pounding, until a maid opened the door and welcomed her inside. The maid led her through wide, beautifully decorated corridors into a grand sitting room. "Please wait here. Mr. Richard will join you soon," she said politely, setting a glass of juice before leaving. Sophie stood by the window, still overwhelmed by the house. From there, she spotted the boy she had fed the night before, Samson. He sat quietly in a wheelchair in the garden, dressed neatly this time, surrounded by colorful flowers. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw a tall, handsome man in a blue shirt with his hands in his pockets. It was Richard Grayson, the billionaire himself. Sophie's palms grew sweaty. "Good morning, sir," she stammered nervously. He didn't answer, only gestured for her to sit. When she did, he spoke calmly. "My name is Richard. The boy you fed last night is my son, Samson. Since the accident that took my wife's life and left him like this, he has barely spoken or smiled. I want you to be his caregiver." There was silence before Sophie whispered, "But why me?" Richard's lips curved faintly. "I've hired many trained caregivers, but they only worked for money. None of them truly cared for him. You did. You risked your own job just to feed a stranger in the rain. You gave without expecting anything in return. That is why I chose you." Sophie tried to protest. "I'm not educated. I'm not a professional." "That is exactly why you are the right person," Richard replied firmly. "I've taken Samson to expensive restaurants on purpose, hoping someone would notice him. No one ever did, until you. For the first time in years, you made him smile. You're not here on a contract. You're here to live with him, care for him, and help him heal. Name your price." "Money will never be an issue." Sophie was offered 900,000 naira monthly, with her own guest room that was bigger than her entire flat. She would work 6 days a week with Sundays off. Relief filled her heart. Finally, she could care for her family. But she had no idea this was only the beginning of a secret that would turn her world upside down. At first, Sophie had no experience in caregiving. All she did was sit with Samson, telling him stories about her childhood. How she and her brother used to race barefoot at the beach, how her mother cooked the best soups in Lagos, and all the little things that made her smile. Samson never spoke, but his eyes followed her closely. Sometimes, he even gave faint smiles. 3 days later, Sophie noticed he could slowly move his fingers. Overjoyed, she placed crayons and paper beside him, hoping he might scribble. At first, he ignored them. But one morning, she entered his room and gasped. On the paper were faint shapes he had drawn. She hugged him tightly, unable to hold back her joy. Days turned into weeks, and Samson began to sketch clearer pictures. One afternoon, Sophie walked in and saw a drawing of a little boy holding hands with a woman. The sight melted her heart. By the end of a month, Samson wasn't only drawing. He was laughing, softly but genuinely. And it was because of Sophie. Richard noticed the change. Each time he saw his son laugh, gratitude filled him. Yet every time he looked at Sophie, something about her voice and her eyes reminded him of someone from his past, a memory he couldn't shake off. 2 months later, the impossible happened. Sophie was reading to Samson one afternoon as he sipped juice from a cup. When he finished, he reached out for more. Sophie poured half a cup, and for the first time since the accident, He looked directly into her eyes and whispered, "More." Her heart stopped. "What did you say?" she asked, kneeling before him. Samson blinked and repeated softly, "More, pour me more." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she hugged him, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, Samson had spoken. From the balcony above, Richard stood frozen, watching the miracle unfold. He had spent fortunes on doctors and specialists across the world, yet none had succeeded. And now, this simple waitress had done it, with nothing but patience, kindness, and love. That evening, he invited Sophie into his study. His voice was heavy with emotion. "I've never seen Samson like this since the accident." "Never." Sophie smiled gently. "He isn't broken, sir. He was only waiting for someone to truly see him." Richard stared at her in silence, his eyes lingering a little too long, as if searching for an answer hidden in her face. For the first time, he looked into her eyes and felt an unusual pull toward her. Rising from his seat, he walked closer, reducing the space between them until she grew uneasy. "Where is your family, Sophie?" he asked gently. She swallowed hard, her voice barely steady. "I never met my father. My mother and younger brother live on the mainland." Sensing her discomfort, Richard simply smiled and thanked her for taking such good care of Samson before dismissing her so she could put him to bed. That night, when Sophie tucked Samson in, he whispered, "Good night." Her eyes filled with tears as she cried softly beside him, overwhelmed with joy she couldn't explain. Yet in her heart, she carried a heavy worry. The way Richard had looked at her unsettled her deeply. In the following months, Samson's recovery amazed everyone. He began to speak more often and could even rise from his wheelchair. To the household, it was a miracle. But for Sophie, new troubles grew. Richard's lingering stares became more frequent, and she couldn't shake the uneasiness. When Samson's birthday came, Richard spared no expense, hosting a grand celebration filled with joy, laughter, and countless photographs. Sophie too had a wonderful time. With her earnings, she was able to pay her brother's school fees, move her family into a better home, and even start saving for her mother's kidney transplant. The Sunday after the party, Sophie visited her family. As she proudly showed her mother and brother the birthday pictures, her mother suddenly froze when Richard's face appeared on the screen. Her hands trembled as she grabbed Sophie's arm. "Who is this man? How do you know him?" she asked, her voice breaking with shock. Confused, Sophie moved closer. "Mama, do you know him?" she asked worriedly. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, her silence heavy with memories she had buried for years. At last she whispered, "That man. He is your biological father." Sophie's world shattered. Her heart raced as she clutched her chest. "What? My father? Mr. Richard, the man I work for? The man whose son I care for?" she stammered in disbelief. Her mother nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "Yes, my child. He is." Everything around Sophie seemed to stop. She begged her mother to explain, and with trembling hands, her mother revealed the painful truth. Many years ago, she had worked as a chef in Richard's mansion. He was wealthy, reckless, and careless with women, always bringing different girls into the house. She ignored his advances, but one night he came home drunk, cornered her in the kitchen, and violated her. Sophie gasped in horror, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Her mother wept bitterly as she went on. "When I discovered I was pregnant with you, I told him. Do you know what he did? He laughed and threw money at me, telling me to get rid of you like you were nothing. But I refused. I quit the job, ran far away, and chose to keep you." Sophie held her mother tightly, her own tears flowing freely. She could hardly breathe as the truth sank in. "So Samson, the boy I've cared for all this while," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her mother nodded. "Yes, Sophie. He is your brother. You share the same father." She paused, her expression hardening. "And I will never believe Richard had nothing to do with Samson's mother's death. That man is dangerous. I only wanted to protect you from him." The next day, Sophie returned to the mansion with a calm smile masking the storm in her heart. She laughed when expected, answered politely, and cared for Samson as usual. But inside, she was no longer the same. She had questions burning within her, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Slowly, she began to observe Richard more closely and ask subtle questions. That was how she grew closer to Mrs. Sharon, the oldest and most trusted housekeeper in the mansion. Mrs. Sharon had worked there longer than anyone, and Sophie sensed she knew secrets no one else dared to speak of. One quiet afternoon, Sophie found her in the kitchen preparing a meal. Offering to help, she picked up a knife and began slicing vegetables neatly. Mrs. Sharon smiled warmly as she watched. "You're really good at this. Your mother must be a skilled cook. You cut everything so neatly." Sophie chuckled softly. "It's you who taught me. Everything I know I learned from you. You're an amazing teacher." They shared a laugh, the room falling into a comfortable silence until Sophie finally spoke again. "Mama Sharon, you've worked here for so long, haven't you?" Mrs. Sharon leaned against the counter, wiping her hands slowly, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. Nearly 25 years had passed before their boss married Madame Evelyn. Sophie tried to sound casual as she asked, "So, you must know a lot about everything that happened in this house?" Mrs. Sharon sighed. "Not everything, but I see and hear more than enough. Sometimes it's better to act like you noticed nothing at all." Sophie gave a faint laugh, then leaned closer. "What about before he got married? Was he any different then? What kind of man was he?" Mrs. Sharon lowered her voice and glanced around the empty kitchen. "Different? Not really. He was wild, always with new women. Sometimes they even fought here in this very house. We, the staff, just kept quiet and watched." Sophie swallowed hard and asked softly, "Did he ever, get someone pregnant before his marriage? Since he had so many women?" Mrs. Sharon gave her a sharp look. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Sophie forced a smile. "Just curious, Mama." Mrs. Sharon shook her head, stirring her stew slowly. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "There was one girl. Angela. She was a good girl. Too good for this place. She worked as a chef here, very humble, very proper. Mr. Richard chased her endlessly, but she refused him. Then one day she suddenly stopped coming. Disappeared completely. Later, we heard she was pregnant. Some said it was the boss's child, others claimed it belonged to another man. I even heard he sent people out to search for her, offering rewards. But no one ever found her again." Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she cut the vegetables. Her heart raced because she knew exactly who Mrs. Sharon was speaking of. Mrs. Sharon turned, placed her hand over Sophie's, and looked at her intently. "You're a sweet girl. Be careful around Mr. Richard. When he wants something, nothing stops him. I've seen how he looks at you lately. Just watch yourself." Sophie nodded politely. "I will, Mama. Thank you." But inside she was burning. She despised him even more, yet she masked her feelings. She had promised herself he would one day pay for what he did to her mother. That night, after putting Samson to bed, she was about to leave when he held her hand softly. "Please, Sophie. Read me the story with the lion and the boy," he whispered sleepily. She smiled, searched his little shelf, and eventually found the book pushed far back. Oddly, she had never seen it before. Sitting beside him she began to read, but midway, she noticed several loose pages tucked inside. They looked like diary entries written by hand. She skipped them and finished the story until Samson drifted off. Carefully tucking him in, she returned to the hidden pages. Her chest tightened when she saw the name Evelyn signed at the bottom of the first entry. Her pulse raced as she remembered Mrs. Sharon's words earlier. Evelyn, Mr. Richard's wife, who had supposedly died in an accident. She locked the door quietly and sat down again, opening the pages with trembling hands. September 3rd. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. Richard has changed, or maybe he was always this way, and I just didn't want to see it. He is cruel, controlling, and cold. I am nothing but a vessel who gave him the son he wanted. He has stolen my freedom, my peace. Now he wants to take Samson from me too. I fear he is planning something. If anyone ever finds this, it means he succeeded." Sophie's eyes blurred with tears. She flipped to another page. October 8th. I told him I wanted a divorce. He laughed. He threatened to ruin me, to take everything. He said the only way I'd ever leave him was if I disappeared, or gave him full custody of Samson. I fear he is planning something terrible. If anyone finds this, please know the truth. Sophie's hands shook violently as she closed the diary. She stared at Samson's peaceful face. Everything her mother had told her, everything Mrs. Sharon hinted at, it was all falling into place. Evelyn hadn't just died in an accident. She had been silenced. Sophie quickly hid the book where she had found it, but just as she turned to leave, Samson screamed in his sleep. "Stop! Stop hurting her!" he cried, thrashing violently. Sophie rushed to his side, holding him tightly. "It's okay, Samson. You're safe. Wake up, it's me, Sophie." His eyes flew open, tears pouring down his cheeks. He was beating her. "My mommy. I saw it. He hurt her so bad, but he didn't stop," Samson sobbed. Sophie's heart sank. She knew this wasn't just a nightmare. It was a memory, one he had carried since childhood. The next day, Sophie was restless. Evelyn's words haunted her, and Samson's cries echoed in her ears. She needed proof, something concrete. That afternoon, when Mr. Richard was away at a meeting and Samson was asleep, Sophie slipped quietly into his study. Her heart pounded as she scanned the shelves. A black binder caught her eye. It bore Evelyn's name. She pulled it out with trembling hands and sat on the leather couch. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, letters, agreements, even a divorce petition. Evelyn had been fighting for custody of Samson, citing abuse and threats. Sophie copied the lawyer's contact information quickly. Then her eyes froze on one last page, a printed email dated 3 days before Evelyn's death. "Sandra, I am terrified. He knows I've spoken to a lawyer. If anything happens to me, please take this to the press. Don't let him erase my voice. Protect my son." Sophie's blood ran cold. It was no accident. Evelyn had been planning to leave him, and he silenced her before she could expose him. Just then, footsteps echoed outside. Panicked, Sophie shoved the binder back and grabbed a cloth, pretending to dust the table. The door creaked open. Mrs. Sharon entered, eyeing her suspiciously. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" Sophie forced a calm smile. "I was just cleaning," Sophie said softly. The boss had complained the office looked dusty the day before. Mrs. Sharon smiled at her and left, but Sophie quickly slipped out of the study too, clutching the names, addresses, and phone numbers she had copied. Barrister Jonathan and Sandra. If anyone still knew the truth about Evelyn's death, it had to be one of them. That night, Sophie sat staring at the number she had written down. Her heart pounded as she dialed Barrister Jonathan. After 3 rings, a calm voice answered. "Hello." Clearing her throat, she steadied herself. "Good evening, sir. I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Sophia. I found your number in a file related to Mrs. Evelyn Grayson. I can't explain everything over the phone, but I believe something terrible happened to her. I think she tried to reach you before she died." There was silence, then a hushed reply. "Meet me tomorrow. Flat 3B Dolphin Estate. Come alone. Make sure no one follows you." Sophie thanked him and hung up, exhaling shakily. The next day, she made an excuse to leave for the market but instead went to see Jonathan. He ushered her into his home without small talk, pulled a file from a drawer, and placed it in her hands. She was going to file for divorce on Tuesday, he explained, voice low. But something happened to her on Monday. Sophie's fingers trembled as she asked, "Do you believe it was really an accident?" Jonathan sighed. "I know Richard Grayson. He's powerful and ruthless. Evelyn was the first who dared to stand up to him, and she paid the price. They buried the petition, silenced the press, and erased her. I was warned to let it go." Tears burned Sophie's eyes, but she raised her head with determination. "If I bring you proof, can you prosecute him?" Jonathan nodded after a pause. "If you give me evidence strong enough to indict him, I'll take the case." Sophie left with renewed resolve and went to Sandra's address, a crowded salon. As soon as Sandra heard Evelyn's name, her face paled. She pulled Sophie into a back room. She always said, if anything ever happened to her, I should speak out. But no one listened. Richard buried the truth. Was she planning to leave him? Sophie asked. She packed her bags. She wanted to take Samson and escape. But he must have found out. She never stood a chance. Before Sophie left, she whispered, "Do you believe he arranged the accident?" Sandra's eyes hardened. "I know he did." That night, Sophie stood in Samson's room, watching him sleep peacefully. She now knew the truth, but she needed hard proof. 3 days later, the mansion filled with joy. Samson took his first steps unaided. Everyone clapped and cheered. Even Mrs. Sharon wept. Sophie cried too, overwhelmed. For the first time, Mr. Richard himself came downstairs to witness it. "Well done, Sophie," he said warmly. But later that night, Sophie was summoned to his study. Her palms grew clammy as she entered. Richard sat in his armchair, brandy in hand. "No therapist or doctor could achieve what you have. Samson walks because of you," he said, smiling. "It was all him, sir. He just needed love," Sophie replied modestly. Richard chuckled. "And you gave him that." Rising, he stepped closer. "You remind me of someone. You're special, Sophie." Before she could react, he leaned in to kiss her. She turned away quickly, startled. "Please, sir, what are you doing?" she asked carefully. Richard smiled slyly. "I can change your life. Money, property, your own business. Everything. Just say yes." Knowing how dangerous he was, Sophie didn't reject him outright. "I'll think about it, sir," she whispered. His grin widened. "Good girl. But don't take too long." Shaken, Sophie left the study. She now understood fully. Richard was a predator, and time was running out. The next morning, while the mansion was quiet, she sneaked into the library. Using a master key she had borrowed from Mrs. Sharon, she opened a locked drawer. Inside was a blue file marked Accident, Mechanic's Report. Her hands shook as she read. The vehicle's brake lines were manually severed. Brake fluid intentionally drained. This report filed privately by instruction. No public record exists. Her stomach dropped. Evelyn's death wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. She snapped photos of the file and quickly left, heart pounding. That night, Sophie decided to take her greatest risk. She laced Richard's favorite brandy with a tasteless truth serum, clipped a tiny recorder under her blouse, and went to his study. Richard welcomed her with a smug smile. "So, you've made your decision." Sophie forced a smile, pouring 2 glasses. "If I'm going to sell my soul, it should at least taste expensive." He laughed and drank greedily. Soon, the serum loosened his tongue. "She thought she could take everything from me," he muttered. "My wife, Evelyn. She threatened divorce, custody of my son, expose me to the press. I couldn't allow it. I paid a mechanic to cut her brakes. She was supposed to be alone. I didn't know Samson was with her." Sophie's heart broke, but she kept calm as Richard slumped unconscious. She slipped out with the recording. By morning, police arrived at the mansion with a warrant. Richard raged and protested, but his hands were cuffed and he was dragged away. Weeks later, the courtroom overflowed with journalists and family. Sophie sat beside Jonathan and her mother, Angela. When Richard was brought in wearing prison clothes, he froze at the sight of Angela. "You," he stammered. Angela lifted her chin. "You don't even recognize your own daughter?" Richard turned to Sophie, stunned. "You're my?" "Yes," Sophie said firmly. "The child you tried to erase. The daughter you never wanted." The judge reviewed the evidence, the diary pages, the mechanic's report, and Sophie's recording. The verdict was swift. Guilty of murder, child endangerment, and abuse of power. Life imprisonment without parole. In the weeks that followed, Richard's assets were seized and legally transferred to Sophie, his rightful heir. Standing on the mansion's balcony with her mother and Samson, Sophie finally breathed freely. Justice had prevailed. Evelyn's voice was no longer silenced. The truth, though buried, had found its way to the light. Evil may hide in shadows for a time, but it cannot escape forever. Sophie's courage had changed everything. For herself, for her brother, and for her mother. Now, tell me, what lesson do you take from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to catch the next story. If you found this moving, please like and share. It may be the message someone else needs today.